let's see how to use forms in Flutter. So I'm going to start as simply as possible. So I have here an empty application. It only says hello world. And let's add a new widget to this application, and I'm just going to call it form1. So here is the new file, and it's going to be a stateful widget. And let's just name this new widget form1. So form1. And now, to keep things simple, what I have here in my main file is this material app. So I want to return a scaffold from my form. So here I want to return a scaffold, and now I want to use this form in my main application. So instead of this scaffold, what I'm going to use as the home of my material app is this new form1. And here we can see it, our form1. Let's go back to the form file, and let's also add an app bar to our scaffold. So I'm going to start simple. I'm going to create here a column, and inside this column I'm going to create these two text fields. And here we have them, the first text field and also the second one. Now, to help the user understand what they are supposed to type in each of the text inputs, I'm going to add a text decoration for each of these text fields. And as you can see, the first text field is going to be used for the username, the second text field is going to be used for the email, and now I can type in here whatever I want. Let me also put the entire column inside a padding so it looks a little bit better. And now I also want to create an elevated button here to allow the user to submit the form. So let's add it to our column. And here it is, here is our button. And let's say that what I want to do after the user clicks on the button is to show the input that they provided. The input they provided for the username and for the email. To do that, we need some way to extract or to get the information, to get the data that the user typed in into these text fields. The easiest way to do that is to use a controller. So let's define two text editing controllers, one for each of the text fields. And here they are. So I call the first text editing controller username controller, and the second one is going to be the email controller. What we need to do now is to connect the text fields to these controllers. This can be done from the text fields themselves. And here, after defining the decoration for each of the text fields, I'm also going to define its controller. So a controller for this one, and this is going to be the username controller, of course, and also a controller for this one, and this is going to be the email controller. Now, whenever we use controllers, we should dispose them. It is considered a best practice, so since we are now using two of them, we should override the dispose function. So override void dispose, and here we should call super.dispose, and now we can also dispose both of these controllers. So username controller.dispose, and the same thing for the email controller. And now it's going to be very easy to extract or to get the data from the text fields. So here, after the user clicks on the submit button, we want to print the value stored in the controller of the username. So it's username controller.text. And let's do the same thing using the email controller. And what we have here should already work. I can now provide some information and type it into the text fields. So let's say that the username is Bobby and the email is going to be bobby@gmail.com. And I can now submit the form, and I can see the output from the form or the information that I just provided. The thing is that this form is not a real Flutter form. So I want to convert it to a real form. To do that, I want to wrap the column that contains my text fields and the submission button within a form widget. So the child of the padding is going to be a form, an actual form, and the child of this form is going to be our column. And we now have here an extra parenthesis, so we should better close it. Here we go. And it looks just as it looked before, but now we have an actual form. Another important thing is that to enjoy the full capabilities of the Flutter form, we should replace the text fields with text form fields. So I'm going to replace both of these. I'm going to change them from text fields to text form fields, because these have built-in validation capabilities, which normal text fields don't, and we are going to use it in a second. Now, let's say that I want to make sure that the user actually typed in something. So if they left either the first text field or the second one empty, and then they try to submit the form, I don't want to show the result of the form. I just want to be aware that the form was not submitted successfully, not all of the information was provided, and preferably I would also like the user to get some visual indication that the form was not submitted successfully. So let's start simple. Let's say here that once the user tries to submit the form, I'm going to check if the text from the controller is empty. And if it is, let's print that the username is empty. In this case, I want to return from the onPressed callback. I don't want to continue to the actual work of the form, which in our case is showing the data that the user should have submitted. So let's return. And now let's do something very similar for the email controller. So if the email controller contains empty text, I want to say that the email is empty. And once again, I want to return. Now we can take it one step further and add here trim. What this is going to do is disregard white space. So if, for example, the user is trying to do something like only providing white space, right? Space, 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 and then they try to submit the form, we're going to catch it anyway, and we can see empty username. Even though it's not really empty, it has some white space here. But because we used trim, we got rid of the white spaces before making sure that it's not an empty string. So this is a simple validation, but it doesn't really use the Flutter form validation. Forms in Flutter have built-in validation capabilities, and this is what I want us to use now. So first, to be able to use these capabilities, we need to add a key to our form. First, we need to define this key, and it has to be defined as a global key. So right at the beginning of our widget class, I want to define this global key, and as you can see, I simply called it form key. You can call it whatever you want, but it has to be of this type. Global key, form, state. And this is the important part. It has to be of this type, form, state. This is what's going to allow us to attach this key to the actual form. Now we can get back to the form itself, and here, right after defining the form, we can specify its key. And the key, of course, is going to be our form key. Next, we can define the validator function for each of our text form fields. So this is going to have its own validator, and also the other text form field is also going to have its own validator. So here goes, validator, and here we need to provide a callback that expects one parameter. The name of the parameter can be, for example, value, and now we need to implement this callback, and value is going to be, of course, the value that the user provided in the text field. So this is going to be a string. Actually, not really a string, but a nullable string. This way, we don't have to use the controller explicitly for the validation, because we have access to value, which already contains the value that the user provided. And what I'm going to do now is go here, and I want to take the simple implementation that we already started working on, and I want to move it from here to the validator that we are writing now. But as I said, now it's going to be a bit simpler, because we don't need to access the controller ourselves. We can replace the controller.text with value. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind is that since value is a nullable string, we also have to make sure that it is not null. So if the value is null, or if the value is not null, but it's an empty string, what we want our validator to do in this case is to return a string. And this is going to be the string. So I'm going to return this string. Otherwise, we need to return null. And this is very important because the validator is supposed to return null if everything was okay. If we didn't encounter any problem, if the validation was successful, the validator function, the callback, needs to return null. And now I can do something very similar to my other text field. So once again, I'm going to define the validator for it, and I'm going to use the same implementation. So let's paste it here. And I'm just going to change the string that we return in case we found an empty string. This is going to be empty email instead of empty username. And now we don't need this anymore because we don't need the manual checks. Instead of checking the values ourselves, we're going to rely on the validators that we defined for the different elements within our form. And to actually fire off this validation, we are going to use our global key. Do you remember the form key? Using this form key, we can access its current state. Then we can call validate. And validate is going to call each of the validators that are contained within this form. Now, if no errors were encountered, if everything worked fine and the validation was successful, validate is going to return true. So this is going to be my condition. And only if the validation was successful and validate returned true, I want to move on to the actual submission of the form, which in my case is represented by printing the values that the user provided. So due to working with a global key, I had to stop my application and restart it. And now if the user actually provides valid data, they can submit the form and we can see the result as expected. But if, for example, they don't provide a valid username and it's going to stay empty, then try to submit the form, we can see that the validation fails. This field is colored in red, and we can see the message that we provided, which says empty username.